Explain to us what you found and how you found it. We understand that you know, there are very direct links, or what appear to be direct links, to the Chinese army.
Yeah, there is. First, we didn't even try to focus on this. It just so happens over the last 7 years of responding to computer intrusions that the data took us right to the doorstep of Unit 61398. We did a dual-pronged investigation where we noticed that Unit 61398 happened to be in Shanghai. They recruited English-speaking people, and they did what we call computer network operations. In addition to that, we responded to intrusions at well over 100 companies, and all the electronic evidence brought us right to the doorstep of where this unit, where there's public information that says this unit happens to reside. So 7 years of studying this group, everything leads us right back to the doorstep of Unit 61398.
So what do you do with this information? What is the next step?
Well, you know, at my point, you got to crawl, walk, and run. There are a whole bunch of companies that are currently compromised by this group. Mandiant released over 3,000 indicators of compromise, meaning we gave information to people so that they can do appropriate countermeasures and safeguards. We've got to get the cancer out of our networks first, and then we can have a more proactive stance and policy on cybersecurity.
Kevin, I want to bring Richard into the conversation. Richard, you know, based on what you know, how closely does Kevin's findings approximate what the U.S. government knows and believes to be the case?
Very close. I mean, it really tracks quite well with what we believe is going on from China. And the essence of this network has been known at classified level for some time. This report provides a level of detail about it that had not been previously known. But it's a very consistent picture that's taken place since about 2008.
And here's a question for both of you, and I'll begin with you, Richard. Why is it that the Chinese government can't cover its tracks better? Now, granted, Kevin said he spent 7 years studying this problem, but if the Chinese are able to break into the Department of Defense, shouldn't they be able to conceal their actions a little bit better?
Well, there's a couple explanations. One is they may get better now that it's becoming so public how all this happens. But two, there's really no consequence. I mean, there's no penalty incurred by the Chinese government and the Chinese state as a result of this. So from one perspective, it's sort of why bother to try to cover your cracks when nothing happens? It's clearly sanctioned by the state.
Well, Kevin, that certainly is a question for you about how you found this building and this place. We want to know a little bit more color and how difficult it was.
Well, it wasn't like it was highly advertised. Basically, we found resumes and articles, and we had to piece together little crumbs that showed clearly that Unit 61398 existed and where the address was. And then we just found a picture of it and looked at the buildings. And one of the more stunning findings we found was an internal document that showed a telecommunications firm that was state-owned building the building actively for the defense or military unit called 61398. So we found a few crumbs, and they all led us to really just locating the location of this building.
So, Richard, that clearly brings us to an obvious question. What do we do about it now? Even if the evidence is somewhat circumstantial, it does seem as though Kevin and others have proven that there are links to hacking.
Well, you can think of a response on several layers. On the one hand, as Kevin said, defense is clearly a priority. So individual companies need to get better with their own cybersecurity. And the U.S. government is trying to do a little bit to help U.S. companies better protect themselves, but basically it doesn't do too much. The next layer is offensive operations against these threats. And we have our own cyber command. I mean, there's 1,000 soldiers and civilians working in U.S. cybercom. The Defense Department is planning to increase that to 5,000. And then the final one is diplomacy. What do we talk about with the Chinese leadership? And here it hardly ever comes up.
Why not get even more aggressive like that? I'm not trying to be a warmonger or even a cyber warmonger, but if what we believe is, or what we've read is true, and that the U.S. government or agents of the U.S. government are able to take out nuclear scientists in Iran, why shouldn't we be doing something akin to that in the case of cyber war?
A couple of issues. One is when you live in the glass house, don't throw stones. So we're among the most vulnerable to this, and we have something to lose. Second is we don't have a national industrial policy. It's not a matter of U.S. policy to help Boeing or Dow Chemical compete better in the global market, whereas for China, they do. So when we use offensive information warfare, we do it for clearly strategic aims, like disrupting a centrifuge plant in Iran. We don't do it to help U.S. companies do better in the global marketplace.
But U.S. companies might like that.
Well, it's a good question whether they'd be willing to receive it. It's a very complicated issue when you help someone win in a marketplace. We've got laws against that. It has elements of foreign corrupt practices. So as a general matter, the U.S. government doesn't engage in industrial espionage on behalf of U.S. companies.
So what does a private-public partnership look like here in fighting the cyber espionage?
I mean, it's relatively narrow, so it relies on information exchange with the internet service providers. And the key thing for the new executive order that President Obama just issued was to share the classified threat signatures, the sort that this report describes, to share them with the ISPs so that they can screen out traffic. Problem is, they have no obligation and in many cases no incentive to do that.
Kevin, I want to bring you back into the conversation for just a second. I know your expertise is not the national security response, but based on what you know, based on what you've been dealing with, is defense the only way to handle this? Or does one need to go on an offensive somehow in order to, to stop what's going on?
Well, I think offense is a complex issue, and I'll tell you why. Right now, there's been rules of engagement that have been followed in these intrusions. So they've been unaggressive in destruction, but they have been stealing intellectual property. Right now, if we go offensive, who knows what will happen if we start poking the eye or poking somebody back. There are 1,000 companies that are pinned on their backs right now. They are actively compromised, and offensive operations may not have the results we hope they would have. Meaning, with 1,000 companies currently compromised, if we do something to provoke the folks that have hacked into us, that could be 1,000 companies that lose business operations in the next day should we change the rules of engagement. In short, it's an asymmetrical battlefield. We've got the intellectual property in the United States, and we're already compromised. Until we get the compromised off our networks, we're very vulnerable if we go offensive.
Yeah, last word to you, Richard. It's a delicate dance.
It is, and as Kevin said, we live in a glass house, and so we need to be careful when we throw stones. But we are throwing some stones, and we will keep doing it. But we're going to see if there's going to be this kind of blowback that Kevin just mentioned.